This happened to me when I was in 4th grade. I am now 42. The internet as we know it wasn't around back in those days. So unfortunately, I don't have any news articles to corroborate my story. But I have a very vivid memory of what happened that day. The day that my friend nearly lost her innocence and possibly her life. Here is the backstory. I have always had this very weird habit that I still do to this very day. I don't know what causes it, but I've always walked on my tiptoes. When I would go to school, I would usually get picked on a lot for this. No matter how much I tried walking flat-footed, I always ended up back on my toes. This led my family to believe that I was destined to be a ballet dancer. As much as I love to dance, I was also a tomboy that preferred climbing trees to wearing dresses. So when my mother, who worked 2 jobs, took me to the community center and signed me up for ballet classes, I thought I would definitely have to learn how to like dresses. The dance instructor's name was Mulaney. She was impressed by my skills but wasn't crazy about my height or my parents' economic status, as this was a very expensive class. At the end of my audition, I was told that I was too tall and awkward. It was a nice way of building up a young girl's confidence. When I exited the classroom and entered the hallway, I heard Mulaney say under her breath that she would not teach poor kids. I stopped mid-stride and turned around. "Excuse me?" And that's when she replied, "I don't teach trailer trash, okay?" My face became so red that my ears were purple. At that moment, I decided that I would knock her on her pompous ass. Before I could react, that's when I felt a hand on my shoulder, followed by a man's voice. "That's a fighter in you. Have you ever thought about trying out karate?" Mr. Diaz was a well-known and respected karate instructor in our county. He wanted me to try out his class and even offered to take me in at no charge. I would be his first girl, but he saw my potential, and I still owe him a lot for this. When I first started training, he noticed my tiptoed footing, and rather than mock me for it, he showed me how to turn them into weapons, as my legs are, to this day, still solid muscle from my calves to my thighs, and I kick harder than a mule. It was around this time that our small town on the coast of North Carolina was being terrorized by a man who had been abducting young girls. He would take them, have his way with them, and when he was done, he would bind their hands together, blindfold them before crossing into another town and dropping them off in the middle of the night. He was a sick bastard. He didn't kill any of his victims, but his MO suggested that he was becoming more and more violent with each incident. Mr. Diaz changed his lessons for a week or 2 and taught us how to use our momentum against attackers to get away. Eyes, nose, groin, and face. He said that if you were attacked, we should try our best to claw and scratch their face and eyes. Not only would this have the chance of blinding them, but it would also make them easy to identify after the fact. More importantly, he emphasized the buddy system. He told us not to scream the R word, because unfortunately, while many people want to stop that from happening, he also said people don't want to see it, and carry that mental image around in their heads. We should scream, "Fire," or "I lost my arm." He said that as silly as the last one sounds, it works. People are compelled to look at a fire, but even more so if someone's arm is falling off. Okay, so now on to the day in question. I was in 4th grade, and the year was 1990, springtime. At the time, I was with my best friend, who we'll call Jenny. Jenny and I decided to take a little walk around the neighborhood we lived in. This neighborhood had 2 main entrances and formed a circle with 2 parallel streets in the middle. Homes were lined along each road, no more than 1.5 acres apart, some even closer. It was very easy to come into one entrance, leave out the other, and not be seen by anyone, even if you were paying attention to the vehicles that were passing through. This was also back when we kept the time by looking at the streetlights. The rule was when the streetlights come on, Your ass better be on your way home." Ginny and I were on the main road heading towards the back. We were just being a couple of young girls talking about boys that we liked and the boogeyman that had been terrorizing our state. A girl that we knew named Kelly had been the latest victim. She was turned from a social butterfly into a psych ward irregular. She even tried to take her own life at one point. As we were talking about this, I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing an unfamiliar car approaching us very slowly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The car was a Pontiac with a faded maroon or burgundy color. The driver almost reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer. He wore these thick, red-rimmed glasses, had tight blonde, curly hair, and had a smile that made my skin crawl. His window was down already, and he stopped the car beside us. "Hello, girls. I'm trying to pay my electric bill, and I can't seem to find the office anywhere. Can you tell me how to get there from here?" Coincidentally, the one electric company in our town wasn't even a mile away from our neighborhood. In fact, I could have walked straight through the woods and shown up at the front doorstep. The only way to pay to turn on the service was in the office itself. Again, this was a small town back in the early 90s. The driver continued, saying that he had to get there to avoid his electricity shutting off. Knowing that he had to have been there before, I stated, "It's where you paid to have it turned on, so just go there." That's when I noticed an open map beside him on the passenger seat. He explained that his mother had been the one to turn on the electricity, and he was new to the area and had just come back from deployment. Something that struck me as odd was that his hair was a bit too long for being in the military, and he didn't have a sticker for getting on base. There are 2 military bases by us, Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point. Both of my grandfathers served in the military. Can you please just show me it here on the map?" He beckoned Ginny over to his car. Ginny was obviously unaware that something was off. I looked around and saw that no one was outside, and I quickly turned my attention back to Ginny and the man. The voice of Mr. Diaz echoed in my head. "Fight if you can't fly. Something bad will happen to Ginny if you don't." As soon as Ginny gets close enough, a look of pure evil forms on the man's face. Imagine seeing a human transforming into a demonic creature. That's the best way I can describe it. "Thanks, sweetie. Just point it out for me right here." He locks eyes with mine and gives me a sickly smile. That's when I quickly grab Ginny. "Wait! Don't lean in!" Jenny's scream echoed across the street, as I look up and saw that the man had reached over the passenger seat and had a hold of her arm. The car slowly began to roll forward as he struggled to pull her in. I yelled as I wrapped my arms around Jenny's upper body. I then pulled back as hard as I could, and I knew it was going to hurt like a bitch once I fell onto the asphalt, but that was okay, as long as I still had a hold of Ginny. We both hit the road, and it hurt like hell, as I predicted. By this time, some of the neighbors heard us screaming, and had exited their homes. I pulled Ginny to safety as the car peeled away. One of the bystanders was the mother of my friend Brandon. She got the tags, and a detailed description of what the driver looked like and his car. The man that we encountered that day was the monster who had been preying on young girls in North Carolina. I don't recall his name. My mother made every effort to keep me sheltered before this incident, and it just got worse after this. Now that I'm a mother myself, I can understand better now. She was proud of me and my actions that day. Ginny was also very grateful, and I'm glad to say that she's still doing well. The girl that I mentioned earlier, Kelly, serves as an example of what could have become of her if I hadn't intervened that day. Kelly has had a rough life and doesn't really speak to anyone anymore. I don't know all the details, but the monster ended up being caged. The descriptions of the car and the driver gathered from my neighborhood aided in his apprehension. I often think back to that day at the community center, where I was scoffed at by someone who thought I wasn't worth the investment. But against all odds, Mr. Diaz saw the potential in a tall, awkward girl who walked on her tiptoes. He was the guiding voice in my head that day, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been able to save Jenny. This took place when I was only 7 years old. Back then, my parents would always drop me off at my grandma's house on the weekends. I always looked forward to staying with her. We would always go for walks around the neighborhood and talk to the people that she knew. My grandmother was always a very religious person, and we went to church with many of the people in her neighborhood. It was a very friendly community. They would often host garage sales on the weekends during the warmer months, which usually had decent turnouts. On one weekend, my parents decided to go to one of the garage sales with us. I was super excited. We usually just like to look around and rarely would buy anything. Eventually, we got to a house that had boxes of toys lined all the way down the driveway. The sale was happening at a house that we had never been to before, and we didn't know who lived there. Once I saw all the toys, I thought I had just won the lottery. While I was busy sorting through the newly discovered treasure, my grandma and parents were a few yards away looking at some dishes and furniture, and making conversation with some of the other people there. An older man, who looked to be around 60, approached me and watched me sort through the boxes with a smile on his face. "My, what a pretty young woman you are. Do you like toys?" I eagerly said yes, not thinking anything of it. I was about to leave to go ask my mom if I could buy a toy horse that I found. But before I could go, he said that he would let me have it for free and gave it to me with a grin on his face. He started picking a few other toys out of the boxes and handing them over to me, insisting that I could have all the toys I wanted. He told me that he had way more toys inside of his house that I could play with as well, and that I should go with him. Before I knew it, I was being led into his house. My mom then came up behind me and pulled me away from him, and then asked what the hell was going on. She was furious, holding me tightly and staring daggers at the man. She must have seen what was happening just in time and intervened. My dad and grandma were right behind her. The man said nothing while my mom and grandma started screaming at him. This caught the attention of every other bystander, and everyone was immediately suspicious. I don't remember what was said, because my dad scooped me up in his arms and took me back to the car. I remember my grandma calling the police before we left. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation at the time. I found out many years later that the man had gone to the same church as my grandma and had participated in a lot of the events hosted by the church, including the youth events. Apparently, the police found loads of child pornography on his computer and was sent to prison shortly after. I'm 19 now, and it still creeps me out thinking about what could have happened to me if my mother didn't see what was going on. Thank God she did. Back in 2001, I worked for a major home improvement warehouse. Let's just say the company I worked for had a thing for the color orange. By then, I had been with the company for about 8 years. My previous position was with HR, an assistant to the regional and store managers. The company eliminated that position, so I asked to be transferred to the RTV department, which stands for Return to Vendor. The girl who was working in that position gave her 2 weeks' notice, so the timing was perfect. The job was to work with the different vendors to get credit back to the store for defective merchandise. Our company had a pretty liberal return policy back in 2001, and some people brought back some strange things like garbage disposal units infested with maggots, old plug-in drills that weren't even being manufactured, you could always tell by the serial numbers, defective lawnmowers, and half-put-together shelves. I've seen it all. My RTV cage, as they called it, was located in the receiving department at the back of the store. It was a 12-foot-high chain-link fence with a swinging door entrance, which I would lock when I would go on lunch break or checked out for the day. I had my computer up on a makeshift stand, where I would process the credits and have vendors sign off on them. You wouldn't be able to see into the cage from outside due to all the bins holding the defective merchandise. One day, a vendor came in for some defective molding. I was standing at my computer with my back towards the guy as he inspected the merchandise. Both the product and mine, apparently. He then told me, "I'll give you credit for everything here." I was about to turn around and say, "Awesome, thanks," but was surprised with a flesh-colored, wrinkled, phallic-shaped hardware hanging out of his zipper. And he just stood there with his hands on his hips, so that I knew it didn't just fall out. I turned around back to my computer, and I felt faint. I thought, did that just happen? Without turning back around, I handed him the RTV paper to sign, and he said, "See you in a couple weeks." I took some time in the cage to compose myself, and then walked to the manager's office and informed him about the situation. I also called the MOD. They like their acronyms. And his reply was, "Well, what do you expect?" And then started laughing. Since this was 20 years ago, I'll go ahead and say that I was pretty cute back then. Tan, fit, always had my hair and makeup done. No matter what I looked like, I didn't expect that from someone I had to do business with. The MOD insinuated that I should expect and accept treatment like that from time to time, and they weren't going to do anything about it. I called the company that the hot dog flasher worked for, and they said, "We'll look into it." Fast forward a few weeks later, and a coworker approached me and asked, "Did you hear? That molding dude did the same thing to a cashier. Now he can't come back into the store anymore." So, that son of a bitch didn't get fired? Apparently not. Looking back on this whole thing, I should have fucking sued them. I'd probably be rich by now. Maybe I should have just laughed and said, "That's all you've got? I've seen bigger ones on newborn babies." But hindsight is always 20/20. In the moment, I froze, because that was the last thing I ever expected to happen. There's always a reason to be afraid.